how a serial killer nearly started a race war in America. The story we'll explore today shocked the world with its brutality. It unfolded just over 40 years ago, and despite countless films, series, and documentaries, what actually happened remains unclear. The circumstances and details are still being examined to this day. This is the story of the Atlanta children. The beginning of terror. In July 1979, on the outskirts of Atlanta, the bodies of two black children were discovered. One had died from strangulation, the other from a gunshot wound. No evidence of sexual assault was found. At the time, no one paid much attention to these murders. Both teenagers, despite their young age of 14, belonged to a street gang that desperately wanted to break into the active drug trade. But police discovered another interesting detail. On both teenagers' bodies, they found pieces of blue carpet. The unfortunate reality? Neither of the victims had this type of flooring in their homes. However, police didn't pay serious attention to this detail at the time. A month and a half later, another child disappeared. A boy had gone to pay rent at a bank half a mile from home, but never reached his destination. Police caught various suspects and other shady characters, but never found the real killer. You probably sense this was only the beginning. Soon, another child died. For some reason, investigators decided his mentally unstable father was to blame, a man who had supposedly kidnapped the child from his mother. The father ended up in a psychiatric facility, while the boy's body was found in an abandoned school's basement. Again, no signs of sexual assault. Again, strangulation. For a year, Atlanta slept peacefully. But in March 1980, a 12-year-old girl didn't return home. She was found tied to a tree with electrical wire. Once again, investigators discovered carpet fibers on her body. Carpet that, as you might guess, wasn't in her home, along with dog hair fragments. Police later learned the 12-year-old girl had been working as a prostitute for months. While the case gained momentum, Atlanta police repeatedly caught pedophiles and people with mental disorders, but all to no avail. The murders continued. In just 1 year, a dozen children were killed in Atlanta. All these children came from troubled families and, as you might imagine, their socialization occurred rather unconventionally. They grew up on the streets, where drinking and smoking were clearly not the worst things they learned. Obviously, their parents simply didn't care about them, but not all parents. After another murder, some parents united into a makeshift committee, primarily for the safety of the city where their children had recently lived. But it accomplished little. The number of murders only increased. Eventually, this committee began resembling some kind of political union. Parents were convinced white racists from the Ku Klux Klan were involved in the murders, and conspiracy theories multiplied. In the summer of 1980, while Moscow buzzed with Olympic excitement, Atlanta trembled with rallies and strikes. Picture scenes not unlike recent events, the entire city rose up in political revolt. Residents vented their anger however they could. You might say suspecting racists of everything is typical conspiracy thinking, sometimes. But examining the historical context makes what happened in Atlanta even more fascinating. The historical context. Atlanta, the capital of Georgia, is a fairly old state formed in the 18th century. Historically, Atlanta wasn't poor, but you couldn't call it very wealthy either. It was the center of an agricultural region. The city's active development began just before World War II and, honestly, ended around the same time. 10 years before the murders, a great population exodus from Atlanta had begun. Population-wise, among Atlanta's residents, half were black, slightly less than half were white, and the division between these two groups ran directly through the city center. It's not difficult to guess these regions were famous for their traditions. Georgia was one of the Confederate centers during the American Civil War, but the Civil War ended in the 19th century. Slavery was abolished, thanks partly to Abraham Lincoln, but problems remained. No one explained to former slaves what to do with their newfound freedom. Right on cue, men in ridiculous white robes were waiting for former slaves. Georgia became home to one of the largest Ku Klux Klan organizations in the United States. They were most active in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But after World War II, the situation changed. Being an open racist simply became shameful. But you must understand that these attitudes couldn't vanish overnight. The social roots of all this ran too deep. Speaking of roots, at the beginning of the 20th century, Atlanta celebrated Jim Crow laws, or simply put, racial segregation laws. Here's how they worked. Black people were called an oppressed race that needed to be safely integrated into white society. How to do this? Create a certain protected space where, if you're black, you can use all social benefits, but please, separately. This was presented as follows. We're not protecting ourselves from them, but rather protecting them from us, as if the situation were exactly the opposite. For that time, the idea of segregation, white separate, black separate, was considered almost progressive. This very model was called the Atlanta Compromise. Now let's imagine the ordinary life of an ordinary black young man. Need the hospital? Please, but go to the clinic for black people. Tired of standing on the bus? No problem. Just note the sign limiting seats for black people to the back of the vehicle. Want a haircut? No problem either, but please visit the black barber. And so it went in every sphere of life. These rules were only abolished in the mid-1960s, that is, 15 years before the series of terrible murders. They abolished the rules, but social stratification didn't disappear. All the money remained primarily with white people, and by the mid-70s, unemployment among the black population reached 35%. What happens when people face total poverty and unemployment daily? Here are literally a couple of quotes from newspapers of that time. One businessman who went to work early in the morning received a broken arm when fighting off a homeless attacker. Women resemble professional toughs when pushing through crowds of drunks and vagrants in parking lots. You can imagine the atmosphere. Murder statistics in Atlanta were simply catastrophic, 45 per 100,000 residents. To put this in perspective, early 1990s, Moscow didn't reach this level. I think you understand that the soil for conspiracy theories in these conditions was simply ideal. You have no job, you had no normal education. Around the nearest corner, someone might attack and rob you of not just money, which you don't particularly have, but your life. Therefore, it's unsurprising that all these fears about white racists emerged. Not only was the social situation depressing, but all those lynching courts and other joys from past times still sat in people's heads. Now I hope you understand where the racist theme came from and why it began gaining traction so quickly in Atlanta at the turn of the 1970s and 80s. Federal intervention. So, in 1 year, 12 children are murdered in Atlanta. The killer walks the streets completely calmly. Police can do nothing. Soviet propaganda took advantage of this situation. President Reagan was called a white racist. He cut all social programs for the black population, doesn't want to give money to police, and this whole story is a conspiracy against the black population of Georgia. So wrote Soviet newspapers. Soviet propaganda could have continued picking apart their overseas partner for a very long time if the FBI hadn't taken on the case. And not just the FBI, but the secret department of criminal profilers. Let's understand what profiling is and how these profilers worked in Atlanta. Profiling is a branch of criminology based on psychology. Here's how one former Secret Service employee describes it. We enter the case when criminologists can't cope. If we study how a crime occurred, we'll understand why it happened, and this will lead us to who committed the crime. Many people somehow believe profilers are some hybrid of Sherlock Holmes and Sigmund Freud, that their task is to find the criminal. The answer is no. Their task isn't to find a specific criminal. Their task is to draw his psychological portrait. What kind of childhood he had, what relationships he had with classmates, whether teachers beat him with pointers or something else, whether he tortured kittens and puppies, and generally how his maturation and socialization process developed. This is the kind of detailed portrait a profiler should produce after their work. It should be said this method isn't a panacea and wasn't a panacea then. There was already evidence that when trying to solve crime series, including sexually motivated crime series, profilers landed on completely wrong trails. For example, there was the story of the Boston Strangler who strangled 13 women in the 1960s. Profilers somehow decided the Strangler was a repressed homosexual. It turned out he wasn't homosexual at all. He was married and killed the first women he encountered. Research from the 2000s showed profilers don't significantly exceed ordinary police in their talents and work results. But let's remember this. There are stock traders, and statistics show they're right maybe 50 to 55% of the time. Those 5 percentage points that affect whether you lost money or earned it often prove crucial. With profiling, it's exactly the same story. The probability that your methods will prove correct, that the killer is someone who matches your psychological portrait, isn't 100%. But in Atlanta's case, this very method became breakthrough. The profiler's portrait. Our main hero with a plus sign is John Douglas, the founding father of criminal profiling. He and his partner arrived in Atlanta when 16 teenagers had already been killed. Naturally, they immediately rushed into battle, began digging through archives. What did they achieve? They produced 2 psychological portraits that strongly coincided with each other. The conclusions from these psychological portraits, compiled by the profilers, greatly displeased the victim's parents and the entire Atlanta public. The first thing they established, this definitely isn't the Ku Klux Klan. The white racist hypothesis was dismissed. Why? Racially motivated murders are, strictly speaking, terrorism. If a terrorist wants to be remembered, if he wants to show that, yes, he committed the murder, he's obviously guilty of all the crimes, obviously he won't hide his identity. Not that he'll walk around waving his identification, but he'll definitely say what organization stands behind the crimes. In this case, no one took responsibility. Obviously, white hoods, Klan members, don't wear them to hide from sunlight. For them, it's a sign. There were no racist signs, no letters to editors, no appeals to mass media. The racism hypothesis fell away. The second important finding, the killer is, with high probability, black. Here, a social experiment was conducted that confirmed this hypothesis. Police sent both white and black cops to predominantly black neighborhoods, and for $5, they asked these cops to look for black boys to help them a little. What did the social experiment show? In almost 100% of cases, if a black cop approached a child, the child did everything required of him. Elementary trust was established. Obviously, if a white policeman had asked for something, something would have come of it too. But with black cops, it worked 10 times out of 10. Obviously, in these neighborhoods, there was overwhelming poverty. And $5, if there's no electricity in your house, that's really big money for you, especially if you don't earn anything, especially if you're a teenager. Eventually, Douglas and his colleague compiled a detailed psychological portrait of the killer. First, the killer clearly sought communication with children and teenagers to receive so-called compensation, that is, respect, recognition, or at least someone to talk to him, something that didn't happen or couldn't work out in the adult world. Second conclusion, the killer clearly has problems with income and education. He's most likely from a poor family and has no normal education. Third, if the killer were too elderly or looked too adult, children most likely couldn't talk to him. There simply wouldn't be this trust, as in the case with black cops in these neighborhoods. Therefore, with one child, this might work, but with other children, this scenario would be impossible. Therefore, profilers were confident the killer is clearly young, definitely under 30 years old. Finally, the last compensation we mentioned above worked not only in the case of seeking recognition or some respect among teenagers and children. It also worked in strange fixations on militaristic or police attributes. Profilers decided the killer should gravitate toward collecting elements characteristic of police, possibly even owning a dog like police dogs, that is, a German Shepherd. The portrait was ready. The media circus. Meanwhile, Atlanta's children were being discussed throughout the country. Everyone was talking, including celebrities. Frank Sinatra organized charity concerts. Coca-Cola released special collectible cards that told children never to get in cars with strangers. Atlanta's mayor promised $100,000 for help in catching the killer. Here's what our profiler Douglas noticed. Obviously, the killer not only followed media publications about his crimes, he literally was obsessed with them. And not just obsessed, he tried to influence them. He understands that, for example, searches are going on in some neighborhood, local newspapers and local television report on this. Therefore, out of spite, heavily disguised in dark nighttime hours, he commits a crime exactly there to show he can do it despite all precautions, despite active police searches going on there. Out of spite, he goes against the entire investigation and literally mocks it. Meanwhile, there were no longer 12, not 16, not 20, but 26 victims. Douglas decides the killer might commit his next crime by throwing bodies into the river to hide evidence, because the streets are full of cops combing through all the forests, and all of Atlanta still stands on edge. Round-the-clock police patrols were installed on all bridges, and that very day, one of the policemen standing patrol by the Chattahoochee River noticed the following. First, he heard a loud splash, as if something had been thrown into the river. He saw how a car that was on the bridge at that moment made a sharp U-turn and quickly drove away. They managed to identify the car. The person sitting behind the wheel was named Wayne Williams. The arrest. Williams turned out to be a 23-year-old black man. He wasn't rude to police. He was quite polite and explained his strange behavior on the bridge as follows. In the morning, he was supposed to have an interview with some music producer, and therefore, to make sure he arrived on time, he decided to check the route at night, specifically at 2 in the morning. While he voiced this original version, police decided to look at what was actually in the car. There they found a shovel and gloves. Police didn't have enough evidence to detain Williams on the spot, so they released him. But police had the opportunity to examine the car more carefully. Despite Williams managing to wash his car, police were able to discover something very valuable there: traces of hair from 12 children who had been searched for and found murdered. On June 21, 1981, Wayne Williams was arrested on suspicion of murder. The profile matches. What kind of person was this? Unlike many of his peers, Wayne Williams came from a middle-income family, but he never found normal work. He built his own homemade radio station at home and was fascinated by music. On this basis, he became acquainted with various people, mainly young people, and considered himself a talented music producer and even DJ. Williams was also known as a pathological liar. He told lies even about trivial matters, and when someone exposed these lies, Williams literally exploded, threw tantrums, screamed, and raged like a wounded animal. I think you've already caught that this didn't exactly match the profiler's portrait, but you know what's interesting? The last detail profilers noted in their psychological portrait, namely, the killer's fixation on police or military attributes, played out 100%. The fact is, some time ago, Williams had been detained at a crime scene where he was impersonating a cop. He didn't commit the crime, but for some reason, he decided to play policeman there. About the decommissioned police car and German Shepherd, I think we don't need to talk about the strange coincidence with the portrait. Williams had a police car and a German Shepherd. The trial. When the trial began, the prosecution ran into unexpected difficulties. Williams behaved like a model child. You can see how he looked: thin hands, very polite, wearing glasses. He couldn't make a bad impression on anyone and communicated very tactfully with everyone, answering all questions asked of him. It seemed, what more could be done? Besides the hair found in his car, there was no direct evidence yet. Therefore, Williams actively communicated with the press, saying racists were to blame for everything. They wanted to make him a scapegoat, and the press actively spread all these interviews. Only one thing Williams couldn't explain: how the hair of 12 murdered children ended up in his car. Douglas began thinking about provocation, about what could show Williams's true nature that his old acquaintances talked about. The turning point in the trial happened again, thanks to the profiler. Douglas had glimpsed this story in some old television program. The probable killer was a person who was restrained, but nevertheless prone to hysterics. Therefore, he needed to be exposed. How to do this? Ask him very many questions about his childhood, literally combing through his entire biography, asking him about how he grew up, how many friends he had, literally about every step of his biography. These questions should exhaust him, and such interrogation should go on for at least several hours. At the end of such interrogation, a secret weapon can be applied to the victim. You can ask him something most important, most decisive, that will drive him out of himself. The prosecutor, on Douglas's advice, did exactly that. He tormented Williams with questions for a very long time, and when Williams was tired, at the right moment, he approached him very closely, touched his hand, and asked, "Tell me, what did you feel when you squeezed your hand on the victim's throat? Did you have even the slightest panic?" And then the entirely decent Williams simply exploded. He began screaming, attacking the prosecutor, threw a tantrum that none of those present simply expected. Everyone was used to a completely different image, a model boy in glasses who had a homemade radio station at home, but somehow became acquainted with young men through music. No one expected such behavior. The jury finally understood that if a person accused of such a serious crime explodes in response to a question about violence, then something's not right here. In February 1982, Wayne Williams was given 2 life sentences for 2 murders. They couldn't prove more. To be clear, by that moment, 28 teenagers and children had been killed in Atlanta. But from the moment Williams was caught, the murders stopped. Lingering doubts. It seemed everything was closed, case closed. But the murdered children's parents were convinced the judicial verdict was written before the trial began. There were 2 arguments. First, Williams was obviously made a scapegoat. Second, one person simply cannot commit all these crimes alone, especially when President Ronald Reagan, who was called a white racist. If it suddenly turns out the killer is actually white, then a full-scale racial street war of annihilation might break out in Atlanta and maybe other United States cities. The problem was also that the profiler Douglas claimed Williams was involved in 11 murders, but not 28. The prosecution constantly repeated that Williams had this blue carpet at home, Williams had a dog at home, and DNA results speak for themselves. But in the 80s, the entire DNA analysis procedure was very primitive, and now we hear news about how there were many false positive sentences by which people went to prison for very, very long terms. Conspiracy theory, even after Williams was sentenced to life imprisonment, didn't go anywhere. Among the people, a version persisted that the murders were actually committed by Klansmen. The FBI conducted a secret investigation for this purpose and confirmed everything, but again, so there wouldn't be full-scale racial war on the streets, they hid all this information under wraps and told no one about the investigation results. In the 2000s, Americans conducted more modern study of DNA tests found on the murdered children's bodies. If you Google the killer's surname in Latin script now, one of the first, most popular search results will be Wayne Williams DNA, and this topic remains the most discussed in Williams' case. These DNA tests showed that the probability that particles found on the murdered children's bodies belong to someone other than Wayne Williams is 0.8%, very little. Moreover, the dog hair found also turned out to be rare. This type of hair belongs to only 1 in 100 dogs. Despite all this, Williams, almost 40 years after his sentence, calls himself innocent. Here's how he looked in a CNN interview about 10 years ago. He still claims he didn't know the victims, that he called them worthless in a moment of emotion, and generally that they made him a scapegoat again. But the story didn't end there. Not long ago, Atlanta's newly elected mayor swore to conduct a new investigation to achieve justice. Wayne Williams himself contacted the victims' parents and wished them luck in the new investigation. However Jesuitical that might sound, results were promised to be published this past summer, but for some reason, at the very last moment, they decided not to rush. Conclusion. The Atlanta child murders remain one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries, or rather, a case where the official solution satisfies few. The story reveals how historical wounds, social inequality, and racial tensions can create the perfect storm for both tragedy and conspiracy theories. Whether Wayne Williams acted alone, whether he was guilty at all, or whether larger forces were at play, these questions continue to echo through the decades. What's certain is that 28 children lost their lives, families were shattered, and a city nearly tore itself apart. The case also demonstrates the evolving nature of criminal investigation, from traditional police work to psychological profiling to modern DNA analysis. Each generation of investigators brings new tools and perspectives, but sometimes the truth remains as elusive as ever. Perhaps most troubling of all is how easily fear and historical trauma can be weaponized, how quickly communities can turn against each other when faced with inexplicable horror. The Atlanta child murders weren't just about one potential killer. They were about a society's deepest fractures laid bare.